Hi guys, and welcome to my channel. My name is Lauren Rumpler, and today I have on Mark Korsky, who has created a beautiful documentary called Engines of Domination. And it is really, really interesting, and it really made me think about a lot of things regarding environmentalism, the human emergency, and anything related to the government. I think this video covers a lot of the historical significance surrounding our enslavement from the government. And so I would recommend this movie or this video to anybody. But I wanted to have him on to ask him a few of the questions that came up for me in the video. So this is the review of Engines of Domination. So Mark, it's great to have you on. Can you tell us a little bit about your video?
Well, first, it's not just mine. It was the film was actually created by Justin Jaszewski. He contacted me out of the blue on Facebook after he'd read my book that the film is based on, and proposed making a documentary about it. And at first, I was really skeptical. I thought he'd make a documentary about a 300-page piece of political philosophy. I looked at his work, and I thought it was just brilliant. I thought, well, it can't do any harm. He may really come up with something. And as the project evolved, we collaborated more and more. It's based on a talk I gave almost 3 years ago now. So the script is mine. Video art is 99% Justin's, about 1% suggestions I made as we went. So although it's called Mark Korsky's Engines of Domination, that's because the ideas are mine, not because I made the film.
Interesting. That's very interesting. Well, I'll have to have you both on at some point. I'd love to hear about, what was going through his head and his research and everything else. I'm fascinated by research and mainly how people do research in the liberty movement because, it's the availability of documents that prove the points regarding liberty are actually semi-difficult to find at times. So I would love to hear what was involved in his research and, because I think we could all use a nice lesson in how to better research, right? So.
Well, I'll say right now we're working on another film about a very little known outside of Europe, very little known anarchist movement called Provo in Amsterdam from 1965 to 67 that ended up having a huge impact on politics and culture there. But the research is a nightmare. I'm writing the script, and most of the sources are in Dutch. The best sources are all in Dutch. And the ones that are online translate badly with Google or whatever's available. And piecing together the different accounts now, 50 years later, it's really difficult to make an accurate and compelling description of this pretty well-documented little event that took place over a short time involving not many people.
Hmm.
The research is very, very difficult.
Interesting. Yeah, it's always sad when you can't find the information that you need for any film. I know when I was creating the myth of Independence Day, it was really difficult to find materials, and you can see from the video that it was difficult for me to edit, actually. But luckily, I've gotten a lot better at editing. But I want to put that video back together and submit it to my new channel because I think it's really great, and I think that's going to be the present that I give everybody on Independence Day is a remake of the myth of independence, which is basically based on a small portion of a renegade history of the United States. Which is another really good book if you're into history, which it seems like you are. Well, I'm going to go ahead and actually get into the first question that I had. So you use the phrase the human emergency over and over again, and I was wondering if you could define that, because my audience and I are very into definitions.
Well, I'm not into definitions, but I'm into trying to make clear what I'm talking about. By the human emergency, I mean a collection of crises and disasters that are threatening the world today and that are occurring today. I classify them into 4 different kinds. The first, really urgent and threaten the existence of human life as such. The first is nuclear war and
Okay.
the danger of the nuclear industry in general. I believe that the threat of nuclear war, I believe it's more likely now in many ways than it's ever been, even though there are fewer nuclear weapons by a factor of almost 30 than there were in the 1980s when there were 70,000 nuclear weapons, and the United States and the Soviet Union were intensely confronting each other with the threat of nuclear war. When I grew up, 1963, I think, the Cuban Missile Crisis, it came within a hair's breadth of happening. We saw it on TV. We saw the Soviet ships stopping at the blockade of Cuba. Accidental nuclear war has nearly happened dozens of times, as recently, to my knowledge, as the 1990s. And that's only the cases of it that we know about. Many people today don't appreciate the danger of nuclear weapons. They think they're just big bombs. They're much worse. A single high-power hydrogen bomb can release as much destructive energy as all of the bombs dropped in World War II in an instant.
Wow, that is incredible.
That's enough to level a metropolis like London or New York City. That's
Wow.
at present, the United States and Russia have something on the order of 2,000 strategic weapons in their arsenals. There are many other nuclear powers, including very dangerous ones like Israel, which has approximately 200, although they won't confirm or deny that they have any. The threat of nuclear war is enormous. It's much greater since a few years ago, the Bush administration announced a first strike policy for the first time in history, that the United States would feel free to use nuclear weapons if it hadn't already been assaulted with nuclear weapons. The United States is
Wow.
also militarizing outer space in an effort to make it possible to launch an offensive nuclear first strike and disable its enemy from retaliating, to shoot down its ICBMs on launch, and to destroy its space-based reconnaissance and weapons systems, and to place weapon systems in space to do this also. The situation is very, very dangerous, and even what you might call a limited nuclear war could be as destructive as World War II in a matter of hours. So this is a critical threat of a kind that never existed before my time. The nuclear industry that not only produces the nuclear weapons but stores the waste from them, that renders us vulnerable to disasters like Fukushima. That's an emergency that will continue to remain for millions of years. Some of the nuclear materials that have been created remain radioactive for incredibly long times. And no one knows how to store such things for geological times. It's difficult enough to store them for decades. I live in New Mexico near two major nuclear storage sites where just in the last few months there was a serious leak crisis. So nuclear weapons and nuclear technology in general is a tremendous emergency. It doesn't just contaminate things, it affects biology because radiation causes birth defects, cancer, things like that.
Hmm.
So that's at the top of my list of the human emergencies.
Interesting.
The
Oh,
second,
thank you. That's extremely interesting. My audience should definitely check out your video for more on that. But I do want to ask you, one of your arguments is that human nature is productive and good, and is the control that it's the control that causes the negative aspects of human existence. Now, I agree with this. However, I wanted to hear your reasoning on this.
I'll be glad to do that, but I really must say that the human emergency, vis-a-vis what you said earlier about environmentalism, the second most urgent aspect is the destruction of the habitat.
Oh, yes.
Which is accelerating at an absolutely horrifying rate. NOAA, the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration just announced that the last calendar year was the warmest year on record since the 1880s. The climate is changing, and it is undoubtedly changing because of the greenhouse gases that are being emitted. And that's just one aspect of the destruction of the habitat: contamination of oceans, contamination of rivers, destruction of land substructures through things like fracking. The planet that we depend on for our existence is being disastrously injured in ways, in the case of the atmosphere, in ways that even if all destruction stopped now, will continue for decades. So I wanted to throw that in because it pertained to what you'd said earlier. About human nature, I think it's the most critical question that comes up. Look at the human emergency. Many people, especially in the environmental movement, think that this shows that human beings are just violent, destructive monsters that the world will be better off without when we've done ourselves in. Short of that, many people tend to talk about humanity as if we are all one collective body, like we dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima. We are destroying the habitat. And I think this is a critically dangerous way to think about things, because certainly we're all human beings, and it is human beings who dropped the atomic bomb and so forth. But strategically, if we believe that we are violent and destructive creatures, we're never going to take the actions that are necessary to address problems like the human emergency. So we have to not fool ourselves into thinking that we're good if we're not, but look closely at the evidence about what kind of creatures we really are. And I think the evidence preponderantly shows that left to their own devices, people are ingenious and cooperative. Farther back than our species, we're primates. Primates live in communities. All primates live in communities. Communities of human beings are what have survived for 250,000 years, and what our earlier hominid ancestors lived in before that for several million years. We're community creatures, and community requires cooperation. Community requires things like mutual aid, where it isn't to everyone to their own good, but there's an idea of something like a common good, where my well-being and your well-being are part of one thing. And the communities naturally organize institutions that enhance the general well-being, rather than some kind of conflict between one faction or another, or one individual versus everybody else in the group. We're cooperative and we're ingenious. Human beings created an amazing amount of marvelous technology long before the Bronze Age, when civilization began. Things that we take completely for granted, like containers. What could be more commonplace than a thing that you carry things in? But that was an innovation, to realize that you could hollow out a gourd and enable yourself to carry many more things than you could possibly carry in your hands, or that you could make a container to live in, a house. We're incredibly ingenious. Those are ingenious. Every bit as ingenious to my way of thinking as a computer. And that ingenuity created ways of living that, until the birth of political power about 5,000 to 6,000 years ago, created ways of living that were remarkably peaceful, cooperative, and egalitarian. I'm not saying there was no conflict. I'm not saying there was no difference in status. But I know that the preponderance of evidence shows that communities before the Bronze Age lacked armies, slaves, great palaces or distinguished dwellings where rulers lived in luxury, great temples where people were deceived into contributing to the luxury of the priests and priestesses. So the evidence is that we're pretty amazing creatures, and I think that's also the evidence of people's ordinary experience. Left to themselves, people tend to trust each other, to treat each other with respect, and to how one another are doing. And violence is amazingly rare.
I agree with you that the level of government has caused people to be violent. I agree with your premise that I don't think that war would exist without the government, which is something I'm going to ask you about in a minute. But the question I have is, can it be argued because tribes had leaders? I mean, they had chiefs. So is it just the size or largesse of government, or do you believe that all leadership is immoral and and uh, and how is it different, basically?
It's different. You certainly need leadership, and you certainly need differences in role in controlling things in the community. The difference is whether the community itself gives rise to those institutions, or whether a faction of people in the community creates institutions for their own advantage by force and deceit.
But isn't control the disease?
No, no, I don't think so at all.
Can you
Um,
explain?
the institutions and traditions in any community control the actions of its members. That can be in beneficial ways that everyone understands and cooperates in, or it can be in destructive ways that are imposed from a privileged center at the expense of the community at large. You said tribes had leaders. They often had more than one. Very frequently, there's a matriarch that basically controls community relations when they need controlling, not centrally dictates them, but when there are conflicts, resolves them. Uh, and maybe a war chief conflicts with external communities. There can be many different centers of control, different persons who are responsible for controlling different aspects, but different aspects of the community's life. But that's a very different thing from when one faction sets itself up by force to control the entire community for its own advantage. That's when the trouble begins.
Sorry about that. My internet seems to have crashed. So, love this computer. So, um, the the real issue that I have is that you equate leadership and control with the ability to cooperate. I believe that people naturally cooperate if left to their own devices because they realize that cooperation will result in the best outcome. When not put under the pressure of government control and government taxation, people tend to cooperate because they're not under that kind of pressure to compete with one another to stay alive. The competition is no longer between each other, but against the elements. Do you see what I'm saying?
I think I do, but maybe I'm not making myself clear. It
Okay.
seems that when leadership arises naturally, it's simply another form of cooperation. We agree here in Taos, we have an irrigation system that goes back to the Spanish settlers. It's controlled by in each area in town, there's an elected mayor domo who basically allocates the water. He says, you'll get it Sunday, you'll get it Monday, and so forth. It's much simpler to have one person controlling that aspect of the community's life. He doesn't seize the control. If he does it badly, he's voted out of office. So when leadership can facilitate a community's cooperation, or it can be imposed by force on a community to make the community comply with what the rulers want. I think there's a huge difference. Then leadership isn't even a good word anymore. Then it's ruling. There's a big difference between leadership and ruling.
Interesting. Because I was going to say, didn't you state in the video that leadership arose from people attempting to control people as shepherds control their sheep in the pasture? And they looked at that and said, can't I just, create a flock from people? So you say there's a difference between control and leadership. Can you go a little bit deeper into that?
Yeah, in the video, I did not say that leadership arose. I
Okay.
said what I define as domination or political power. The domestication of communities arose when people decided they could possibly domesticate their fellows in the same way they domesticated goats and plants. So then it's not leadership anymore, in my view. That's a pretty name that's given to people. We call, in North Korea, the tyrant is called the great leader. But he isn't leader, leading, commanding. So the ability of small faction to direct the human energy of a community to its own advantage is ruling. And that's what arose when people applied their natural traits of domesticating and harnessing external sources of energy to their fellow human beings.
See, I totally agree with you on that. I have always stated that I am happy if people decide that they want a small government in their community, but overall, I still think state governments are too large to be able to handle handle the job that they would need to do to take care of people voluntarily. And I don't believe that a government that large is voluntary. But small community governments or a small tribe leader can be very voluntary. People can decide that they want to mandate leadership, much like there's an anarchist company, video game company, that the name is escaping me at the moment, but there's an anarchist video game company where no one is really in charge, but they often have someone leading the group just for clarity and because they happen to have leadership skills, and I believe that some people naturally have the ability to lead well, and I think that that can be a valuable skill as long as it's voluntary. Would you agree?
Oh, sure.
Awesome, awesome. Okay, so we're on the same page about that. I just wanted to clear that up because that was something that I was not certain about in the video. But I like your answer. I agree with you entirely on the difference between leadership, control, and domination. So let's see. You also seem to imply, and you didn't, I don't think you directly stated it, but you seem to imply that disease is because of government. Is this true?
Disease?
Disease.
Oh, well, no, I didn't mean to imply that, and I certainly didn't state it. I said that one aspect of the human emergency is that population, half the world's population is living in cities now, often
Yes.
under incredibly crowded conditions, and that makes them vulnerable to health issues that never existed before. The cities are toxic, toxic air, toxic water, and cities are high stress for most of their inhabitants, especially the lower classes. The combination of toxins and stress and crowding makes, and coupled with world transportation, makes pandemics possible that were never possible before. Also, malnutrition. A lot of the food that people eat is frankly unfit for human beings to eat. That reduces your immunity too. But there are governmental contributors to disease, certainly by causing famines, by destroying health facilities like hospitals and water systems, sanitation systems in wars, creating biological weapons to be as virulent as possible, and hoping that you can contain them. Again, at Los Alamos, 75 miles from where I live, we have a bioweapons research facility that we keep trying to shut down and failing to shut down. But no, I certainly didn't say that political power causes this, but the way it organizes human energy into huge cities is very dangerous, and the way it has degraded the conditions of human living aggravates the possibility of serious health disasters.
So it's more like a correlation, not causation, kind of deal.
Well, both. Caution in the case of destroying the infrastructure for health in wars or by economic sanctions and so forth, and a
So
corollary.
unintended consequences.
It's not an unintended consequence when you bomb a hospital.
That's true. I meant gathering in cities.
Yes.
Gathering us in these tight-knit groups. The original layout that they planned, it wasn't intentional causation, but it was technically causation. That
Yeah, you needed to have a lot of people concentrated together to run a seat of power. The health issues are a consequence. That's become increasingly bad in the last few centuries. It probably wasn't as bad in Rome, but I really don't know about that.
Okay, interesting. So I I thought that was a really interesting thing, and I think that a lot of people might miss that when they're watching it, so I thought I'd bring it up because I actually was it was a light bulb moment for me. I didn't think about the fact that the government had basically made it necessary for people to gather into small areas for work, um, in order to pay the government, and so to give their debt to Caesar, and so therefore that would cause diseases to become rampant because people are no longer spread out, and a lot of disease is caused by small, compact areas of people living together. So I thought that was really interesting, and I thought that was a good point, and definitely was worth talking about. And there was another that we keep bringing up. Um, so I think you directly stated in the video that war would never exist without government, and I agree with you um, entirely. However, there are many people that don't. Many people, like Ayn Rand, claimed that neighbor would fight neighbor in a state of complete anarchy, and with voluntary leadership, it is still anarchy. And people mistake that. They think that voluntary leadership is not anarchy, and it is. Anarchists do understand, they believe in rules, not rulers. Um, and so I was wondering what your argument would be against Ayn Rand stating that neighbor would go against neighbor and kill one another in a state of anarchy.
The burden of proof is on her, and there's no evidence. If you look at the art of prehistoric peoples, and then the art that happens once civilization begins, you find a remarkable lack of depictions of weapons and fighting. And the first anti-personnel weapon, the mace, was only invented after civilization began. The weapons of prehistory can certainly be used for killing people, but they were not designed for it. They were designed for hunting and self-defense.
Yes, they were.
There was undoubtedly conflict between prehistoric peoples. People fight, people disagree. But a lot of that, there is no evidence of large-scale warfare or organized armies. There may have been fighting units that came together in the case of conflict. There's a lot of evidence that some of that conflict was ceremonial. People, like when animals do a territorial defense play, where they challenge each other and respond to the challenge and maybe exchange, some blows of the antlers or whatever to establish some kind of dominance relation over the territory. There certainly was ritualized fighting, and there was undoubtedly fighting, but nothing like organized armies and war and conquest that followed from the birth of civilization. So the idea that everyone would fight everyone, that's Thomas Hobbes, the war of every man against every man, and it reflects a dismal and highly unrealistic view of human nature. I have to wonder about how the people who argue that, what they see when they look in the mirror. Would they go out and fight with their neighbors? Maybe that's what they think, but more likely I think they just think people are trash, except for them. And they would go fight, beasts that they are, unlike me. It's disgusting to me. There's no evidence for it. If we were like that, we would never have survived for 250,000 years. When we existed in very small numbers, we would have exterminated each other.
I totally agree. The burden of proof is on her, but I did like your response to it, so I'm very glad that I asked the question. I agree entirely. I've always thought that claim is irrational at best. It's a disgusting view of the world that people promote, this idea that people would simply hurt one another in order to resolve any conflict. And most people want to resolve conflict very peacefully. It's when they are put in a position where it's a me or them kind of situation. And mainly it's the government that puts us in that kind of situation where there is a created scarcity intentionally to control us. And so I don't think that this is a valid claim, and I'm glad that you address this issue, because this has been something that I've been arguing back and forth with orthodoxy objectivists for a long time, and it's why I'm kind of far out of the objectivist circle, because I'm an anarcho-objectivist, and I disagree with the premise that, with Ayn Rand's view of anarchy, basically. So one of the things that I took issue with was kind of the stance I took from the video, and I'm not sure I understood it clearly, so I'm going to ask you about it, was the stance on corporations. So it's almost seemed as if the video put a negative light on corporations. And what do you mean by corporations? Maybe we just don't, we're not seeing eye to eye on what the definition of a corporation. So why don't we start there?
Well, by a corporation, I don't mean what happens when people freely produce and exchange and trade goods and services. I mean a collection of people who are granted extraordinary powers by the state, usually some kind of legal monopoly to do some kind of business. The prototype corporations were the great colonial corporations, the Dutch East Indies Corporation, the ones that England and other countries created in competition with them. These were military powers. The British one had a much larger army than the British Empire. The Dutch East India Company had a huge army. These companies, these bands of rich merchants, bankers, and traders, were granted a license to conquer people, to seize their lands, to expropriate their resources, to subject them to force. That was the prototype, and that was close to 500 years ago. That in fact is why when the United States was founded, people seriously considered placing articles in the Constitution restricting the powers of corporations. In the end, it was left to the states, and most states wrote extremely restrictive laws because they'd suffered under these companies. Extremely restrictive laws about how large businesses could organize and operate, banks in particular. That was during the boom days of capitalism that many capitalists, many libertarians point to through the 19th century. Through that, despite all those government regulations, the United States became the world's foremost industrial power. At the same time, it produced a number of extraordinarily powerful and power-hungry industrialists, financiers, who worked at eroding legal safeguards. First eroding them. You'd erode them in one state, you'd get less restrictions on business in that state. Business would flood there, the other state were forced to follow suit or lose business there. It began by removing the safeguards against corporate power, then granting privileges to corporate power. The Supreme Court acknowledged the corporations could act as persons in expressing beliefs, like through political funding. From there to the Reagan years, when restrictions on corporations were minimized and they were granted even more immunity and privileges, you got a new form of tyranny. You got a new power that had previously really greater than it ever existed before. Chomsky calls them private tyrannies, because the people who run them can unaccountably dictate what all the people under their control do. This is not cooperation. This is being the company man. This is being told how to dress, how to act, basically how to think, to operate as a cog in the corporate mechanism. So I'm not talking about business. I'm not talking in general. I'm not talking about trade and production of goods and services. I'm talking about concentrations of power that control more and more of the world's lands, human energy, and political policy, because they control government policy, control government decision, write policy that's enacted into law through lobbyists, place advisors in key posts. Essentially, the United States today is ruled by corporate power, using the government as a strong arm. So I hope that makes clear that I mean by corporations these incredible concentrations of power, not something benign like I bake cookies and you make ovens and we all have a nice, happy community.
Interesting. Yeah, I was hoping that that was what you meant by corporations. The official definition of corporations is an entity of business that is authorized to act as a single entity. But basically in the video you're voicing your concern with crony capitalism, and I totally agree. Crony capitalism is an issue that only exists. Monopolies only exist because of the government, and many people don't understand this. So I'm totally on the same page with you. I was wondering going into the interview if if you might be an anarcho-communist just based on the issues with corporations, but I'm glad to know that it's just crony capitalism that you take issue with.
I honestly think crony capitalism is a weak word for it because it suggests something chummy between those in power and those in the corporations. It's corporate capitalism, where you have a fusion of corporate management, corporate influence in the state. I don't want to bicker about words. As to being an anarcho,
Nor do I.
I am a pure anarchist. I believe that human communities thrive best without rulers. And actually, my whole argument in my theory is that political power is unsustainable, that there's no long-term way for humanity to survive under political power. Personally, my views about how I would hope to see communities organized in the absence of domination tend to run more toward sharing, gifting economies, communities cultivating a common good than toward a picture or sign of private enterprise, but that's just a dream. And I would never try to tell anyone how the world should be in the absence of domination. If we ever get to where we can decide such a thing, that's for the people who are living here and there in each location and under each set of conditions to decide. Did I just lose you again?
Yes, so I agree with you. Actually, what's interesting about your interest in gift culture is it's funny because my co-host and I, for True Objective, did a show on the history of money, and actually the first early occurrence of any trade was basically gifting. So people would go over to someone's area and they would cook them a meal, and then it was basically like almost you owe me, except for it was like implied, like it was a kind of almost olive branch, except for there weren't any issues to begin with. It's like saying, I'm on your side, I'm your friend. And so it was operating. The first instance of trade was gifting culture. It's the earliest. It's before we had wampum and other sorts of trade tools.
What do you do? How do you treat someone that you really care for? You do nice things for them.
Right.
You don't do it because they'll do something back, but quite naturally, when someone's done something nice for you, what do you want to do? Do you want to just go off in your little hole and say, ha ha ha, look what I got? No, you want to do something nice back. That's human nature. And
Right.
it can evolve into elaborate systems that really increase the well-being of the communities that practice them.
And when you find the value, and you always do, when you make friends or live in an intentional community with individuals, you find their value. You already know what their value is, so it's easy for you to, exchange value to them and give them value that you're not necessarily going to get in return, because you already know that this person has good intentions. You know that this person is valuable to you. You want to have them in your life, and so it isn't a tit for tat kind of thing. Trade really is more beneficial when you're dealing with someone that you don't know. And somebody that you're not certain of their value. Once value is established, I think most people operate from a gifting kind of perspective, and I don't see any issue with that. I think that's wonderful. I think it's great that people are able to demonstrate value to one another and be able to act in a way where it's, you're not keeping score. I think that's a beautiful thing about friendship and intentional communities like the Free State Project. There's a lot of, gifting around here.
It's human nature.
It's
I
human
don't
nature
think
is
it's
so beautiful.
and when you have to go back to corporations for a moment, a corporation of the sort we were discussing is chartered to pay dividends to its stockholders. That's its purpose in existence, is to get more profits. When you change from the contrast between gifting relations or sharing relations and relations where these separate entities are all trying to come out ahead, and that's their primary goal, and they'll do basically whatever is necessary and possible within the law to come out ahead, you've got something inhuman, institutionalized. There's nothing wrong with coming ahead, there's nothing wrong with gaining as such, but when it's the primary purpose and you do whatever is necessary to come out ahead, then you set in motion something very dangerous.
Agreed. So one of the other questions I had about when we're speaking about business and corporations and other things, I think it was implied, not directly stated in your video. It seemed like there was a slight issue with the drive for power. Do you find that that's a negative thing?
It depends on what kind of power.
Or I'm sorry, drive for profit.
Well, that's basically what I was just talking about. If profit means, yeah, when you isolate that and make it an autonomous motive, it's inhuman. There's nothing wrong with profiting from doing things that benefit others. But when you are out to profit, regardless of whether it's benefiting people, that's immoral. It's absolutely immoral. If I think I can profit by producing a dangerous or destructive commodity, or by creating desires for commodities that people do not need or will harm them, that's monstrous. Profit should be a corollary of serving human well-being, not a substitute for serving human well-being.
And do you believe that people are supposed to be around to serve other people's well-being?
To serve the common good. I'm not, that carries implications I don't want. The common good has been the purpose of human communities for most of our existence.
Purpose based on what?
First, based on obtaining life support. Every community's first problem to solve is how it obtains its life support. Once that problem is solved, then how the community's life can further flourish is the question of the common. What conditions are necessary for human well-being in a community? You have to have honest and forthright relations. You have to have in respect for each individual's private sphere and a public sphere where people act in non-destructive and predominantly helpful ways. I'm not talking about some kind of dichotomy between individualism and collectivism, or between egoism and altruism. The individual is always part of a community, and the community is composed of individuals. The common good.
But it does seem to pose a dichotomy between the two when you state that people's motives should not be for themselves but for the well-being of others.
I said profit.
Right.
Profit, monetary gain.
Profit, anything.
Monetary gain. When you have an institution whose primary purpose, I thought the entire argument for trade was that I have something that you feel you will benefit by obtaining, and you have something I feel I will benefit from obtaining, and by exchanging, we both gain. That makes perfect sense to me.
Right, but my goal in trading with someone is never to benefit them, it's to benefit myself. People are innately
Really?
selfish.
Well, my
If
goodness,
we
I don't believe that at all. I taught ethics for 35 years. I charged as little as I could and actually worked for several years at a school as a volunteer because I loved to teach my students.
Exactly, and you were doing it because of that love, not for the
It
students. It
benefited
wasn't
them, though.
self-sacrificial.
I only loved it because it benefited them, Lauren. If it hadn't done them any good, I would have felt like some kind of maniac, loving doing something that wasn't having its intended effect. I loved it because I was a really good teacher, and my students loved what they got from me, and they got a great deal from me. Uh,
Exactly. You loved it for whatever reason you loved it, but if you hadn't loved it, you wouldn't have done it.
I did it at times when I didn't love it. Like any kind of love relation, you have to keep in the relation at the times. Sometimes it's most important to remain in the relation when it's least rewarding. There are ups and downs. Uh, I was doing it because it was a good thing to do. Uh, I think we could really wander off into a long conversation about self-interest and community relations that might really keep us from discussing other important things in your list. But
Well,
profit,
I think it is
profit,
important, though.
monetary gain, when it's institutionalized as a purpose, divorced from the well-being of the people who are bringing you those profits, I think is very dangerous.
But to state that the community well-being is more important than the individual well-being is to deny the basic unit's importance and therefore the entire unit as a collective.
I see.
So how can you say that the smallest unit has less value than the larger unit?
I don't think
When
I don't think communities are composed of units that are individuals. Uh, if the individual were a unit, it could exist independently of the community. Human beings independent of communities are feral people who are lucky to survive. People are born in communities. They inherit the language, the knowledge, the traditions, the, the ways of living of the community. You cannot have a community without individuals, and with very rare and untypical exceptions, you can't have individuals without a community. An individual can leave a community, but if he or she doesn't leave it, equipped by that community with what makes them a full human being, language, culture, knowledge, uh, an orientation in the world, they aren't fully human. I don't think you can separate the two as if you built a community out of individuals the way you build a house out of bricks.
And I'm not saying that people aren't part of a community and that they're not born into a community. I'm simply stating that it's naturally incentivized to cooperate with a community, but that doesn't make the individual any less important.
Oh,
I
no,
mean,
no.
their value, their drive is in creating the best life for themselves, whether it's enjoyment of whatever they're doing or drive for profit. And I don't see any difference between the two. I mean, I would rather have a doctor that is driven for profit and is the best in his field than someone who is half as good and just loves what he does. Do you disagree?
A doctor driven by profit and the best in his field can be dangerous. Our hospital here in Taos, when I moved here 25 years ago, it was an outstanding rural hospital with a small and extremely dedicated staff. A large hospital corporation bought it out. It now has a policy to force upon its surgeons to do as many procedures as possible to make the greatest profits. They are penalized if they don't do as many operations as can be medically justified. Now think about that for a minute. It's
But you're
possible.
talking about the difference between individual drive for profit and corporation drive for profit. I'm not talking about the virtue of corporation drive for profit. I think that a corporation that is organized by a group of individuals that are not collectively for that profit, I think that's going to end in ultimate demise. And any corporation that values itself as a collective instead of as a group of individuals is a negative thing. But that's what I'm saying, is that many doctors go into a field individually for profit, and I don't think that there's any issue with that. I think that there's some of the best doctors in the world that are simply in it for profit. And you and I are talking about the difference between a corporation and an individual. I'm talking about the individual.
Okay, well, I would much rather have a doctor whose primary goal was the health of his patients, period.
Even if he weren't the best in his
Enjoyed
field.
any profits, who enjoyed any profits that he might come by in delivering the best health care to the fullest. But to me, a doctor whose primary purpose is not the health of his patients uh, doesn't deserve to be a doctor. There
So
are superb doctors in very very poor parts of the world who barely make a living and provide great health care and are glad to be doing what they're doing. To me, the profit is a bonus, and there's nothing wrong with. I don't want to say doctors should not be able to make a whole lot of money if they do a whole lot of good, but in medicine, above all, the beneficiary of the doctor's work should be the patient. And a doctor who's primarily out to make a profit, no matter how skilled they are, what is to prevent them from doing unnecessary procedures? What is to prevent them from generating work for themselves? As the
because
pharmaceutical
no one is going to trust their value once they find out that that's what they're doing. I mean, there's natural incentive to be a honest and a person with integrity. I mean, that just because you're out, especially people who are out for profit, they don't want issues with integrity to cut into their pay. And I mean, without protection from government and and being hidden from that and intervention, those people will lose their position in the community and eventually have to find a different field to go into because no one trusts them.
Ideally, that may be true. On the other hand, I can see a doctor of the kind I'm describing doing a great deal of harm before that eventually happens. And morally, I don't believe you can justify a doctor practicing without putting his patient's welfare first.
I see your point in them doing a great deal of harm until that eventually happens. But with the advent of the internet and the easy flow of information that we have, it wouldn't be long before people would find out what that doctor is doing. And as we've seen with many companies that have gone out of business because of bad practices, people do eventually find out and they take action. And I think without feeling protected by the government, they're going to research more thoroughly and be able to detect bad malpractices.
Again, ideally, that may be true. But I was responding to your saying that you saw nothing wrong with a doctor who was the best in his field and was primarily out to make a profit. And I said that I believe that was immoral because a doctor's primary moral responsibility should be to his patients. Then I argued that he could do a great deal of harm by superfluous procedures or incorrect diagnoses and so forth if his profit was his primary motive. I believe that monetary profit can be greatly beneficial to helping good things happen in a society. I'm not opposed to it as such. I'm opposed to making the profit motive I'm opposed to declaring it morally good in itself, regardless of what the person who's pursuing the profit is doing to get it.
I don't think people are going to be making profit very long if they're not people of integrity and people who follow good values, and understand their hierarchy of values well enough to know that in order for them to make that money, they're going to have to exhibit those values to others.
In a
But
free and egalitarian society, I'm sure that's true, but that's not what we're living in now.
and I mean, you keep referring to my premise as an ideal, but I mean, it's no more ideal than the idea that we would eventually give up arms. I mean, in your video, you state that, it may seem like an ideal, but, why not go for the ideal is basically the entire closing part of the video.
Oh yes, that's certainly true. When we started off on this topic, you said that the video gave you the impression that I was opposed to the drive for profit. The actual statement, I believe, in the video is about war and conflict, that putting throttles on corporate power would greatly reduce military conflict, quote, because most of that conflict results from the drive for profit. And there I'm talking exclusively about the corporations that benefit from war and from hostility and from conquering the nations and human energy of the resources and human energy of other nations. So there I'm talking totally out of the ideal context.
Right, but I don't think that those corporations, I don't think the drive for profit is the real issue. I think it's the fact that they have an institution that is large enough to allow them to be able to start those conflicts. So I think the primary problem is not that drive for profit, but the agency that is available to allow them to use that kind of force against another country or a group of people, don't you think?
I agree with you there completely.
Okay. Fantastic. Well, we'll go with that, and agree on that. Let's see. So I actually where am I? Let's see. Next question. We'll go with something a little more. Can you tell me more about how the government destroyed the environment? Because I loved this part of your video, and it gave me a new reason to dislike the government. It's pretty fantastic.
Well, first of all, natural communities are limited in how much they can damage their habitats because they depend on the habitat. They depend on it for their life support. They are part of the habitat, one part of an ecosystem. If they damage their habitat, they damage themselves, and they either have to disperse or perish. Once you have political power in place, it puts a much greater burden on the habitat for things that don't have anything to do with life support or well-being. You have to have temples, you have to have palaces, you have to have great roads, you have to have vehicles. The Mediterranean woodlands were devastated thousands of years ago, starting near GNC and moving toward the Atlantic Ocean by empire after empire as it wiped out the timber for its construction needs. It wasn't common people, it wasn't merchants that were doing that, it was the huge seats of power in the empires. Political power uses vastly more natural resources, and it can use them, take them by force. If it needs something that isn't within its own domain, it can conquer the other domain or raid the other domain and take it. It's also not accountable for the damage it does. If your neighbor is doing something that in the habitat that is troublesome to you, you can try to reason with them, or you can have an argument with them, or you can try to exile them. There are lots of recourses. There's no recourse whatever when the Spanish crown comes in and starts to clear your forests. Their response to that is they'll kill you or put you in jail or whatever, or kill your village, kill everybody. So the destruction becomes uncontrollable, and the scale has to increase as the scale of power increases. Then once you have the kind of corporate power we were talking about earlier that profits by seizing land and putting it to destructive uses like strip mining, deforestation, stuff like that, the destruction accelerates. at the scale of global power today, uh, the habit, and then secondary consequences of corporate power, like contamination. Uh, you can put what you want in the river. The river puts it in the ocean. When it's in the ocean, has effect on the sea life. The controls are removed. The controls by the community on what the entities that are causing the damage do is removed. They have legal immunity. A corporation, the owners of a corporation are not legally responsible, or are not responsible personally for the damage the corporation does. The corporation can be sued, but you can't make them pay for it. It's called limited immunity. So through all of that combination of mechanisms, not to mention war and the destruction caused by military, putting in military bases, one of the most greatest atmospheric polluters is in the world is a military jet or a rocket. They really trash the atmosphere in a way that makes even a really stinky car look like nothing. So put all those things together, and the destruction of the habitat that we see today first would never have happened without political power, and today is being greatly accelerated by political power in the service of global corporate power.
Okay. All right. So I just really enjoyed that part of the video, and I thought you might want to further explain it. But I also had a question about, you state that the political power was the advent of society, correct?
Civilization.
The civilization. Okay. So is agriculture not really the creation of civilization, since in order to grow you must settle?
Oh, there were large settled agricultural towns and systems of villages and communities for thousands of years before the first great cities. Civilization is usually defined in terms of cities, advanced cultures, writing, and so forth, which began 4,000 to 5,000 years ago. Through the late Neolithic, there were large permanent settlements with advanced cultures, with extensive agriculture, and so forth. What happened at the birth of so-called civilization was the political power was invented. And then therefore the great cities and the armies and the temples and the palaces and the slaves and the war began. Huge difference.
Okay. All right. So you have no issue with people settling for agriculture, correct?
No, although there are some strong arguments that agriculture has its own inherent dangers. I think those dangers would have been addressed before they advanced to a serious stage if political power hadn't been invented. But that's peripheral to my argument. No problem. What people do voluntarily in cooperative communities is necessarily limited in the destruction it can cause, because if it starts to harm the common good, people will either perish or change their ways and avoid that kind of destruction. I have no problem. No, obviously not. The problem is political power. The creation of this thing, this device that I call domination, a tool from tools of human beings, a system of institutions that captures human energy and the riches of the habitat and convert them into the power and privilege of the rulers.
Now, you just stated that you have no issue with what people do in a voluntary society. But you also say that we need to forbid the use of tools. Wouldn't that mean that there must be force in order to prevent the use of that which is forbidden?
When did I say we need to forbid the use of tools?
It was in the video.
We need to forbid domination.
Right, and how would we forbid domination in a society without domination? Is my question.
You've got my head spinning. If we were in a society, you mean how would we keep it from recurring?
Yes.
I think it could be nipped in the bud. To First of all, when domination was first invented, people had no horizon against which to see what kind of thing was being created. There had never been anything like it. There had never been anything like mass systems of thought control in state religion. There had never been anything like uh, kings, palaces, temples, slavery, landholding by force of arms at a huge scale, where the soldiers would come and tell you what you could or couldn't do, or where you could or couldn't be. They were taken by storm. It happened within 1,000 years, and really within a few hundred in each region where it developed. Now we have 6,000 years of experience to know what this thing does when it's in operation, what this engine of domination does to the world. And if we understand how it arises through a combination of controlling people's life support systems, through creating threats and deceit that channel people's action into ways that serve the rulers, through an amassing of weapons that allow a military force to arise and so forth, the abhorrence that people will feel when they, if we ever get there, we may not, the abhorrence that people would feel looking back at what has happened in the last 6,000 years, plus an understanding of the mechanism that had caused it, I think would be enough to nip it in the bud as it began to appear anywhere. I have no idea. I cannot predict the future. But if voluntary relations are prevailing around the world, then things that begin to disrupt them and impose involuntary relations would certainly rile people up like crazy.
I wish it riled them up now, but you know.
Now we're used to it. Everybody thinks it's got to be that way. You know, this is the way of the world. It's civilization. It's progress. Look
And
at all
a lot of people argue that if we were in an anarchical state, that many people would be attempting to reestablish the government because they're so used to it. They've been so infantilized. What would you say to that?
I think it's a fantasy to say if we were in an anarchist society. No one knows whether it's possible to attain one. There have been anarchist rebellions, and there have been successful establishments of local anarchism, notably in the Spanish Civil War, when in some parts of Spain more than half of the land and industries were put in under the people's control. But there's never been, since the beginning of, we lived in anarchism for 250,000 years without rulers, without these institutions of power. Since then, more and more of the world has come to be under the control of ruling institutions, and especially in the last 200 or 300 years. Now, it's very hard to be any place where you aren't. I believe, in principle, it can be abolished because it was a creation of human ingenuity to figure out how to domesticate now the entire world. I don't see why human ingenuity should be limited to having to being enough to invent it. I think people may prove ingenious enough to be able to abolish it, although I don't see how. Once that's happened, who knows how people will live? It's not going to happen suddenly. Certainly, if someone waved a magic wand and the institutions of political power disappeared tonight, but nothing else changed, there would be an immense upheaval, and maybe the kind of things people are talking about would happen because they are used to being either leaders or followers, giving orders or taking orders. There might be an immense power struggle. It's fantasy. It isn't going to happen. What is possible is that political power can be reduced. It's been reduced times in the past. It's always regrouped and come back stronger. You certainly can't trust political power to reduce itself or stay reduced. It's going to take a huge popular struggle, many kinds of popular struggles, many places in the world to accomplish that. When it's been reduced to some degree, maybe it can be reduced further. If it's reduced enough, maybe it can be overthrown. It's certainly, I don't see how it can possibly be overthrown today, at least without tumbling the world into a real kind of chaos that has nothing to do with anarchism, but to do with the fact that our life support systems are inextricably tied in with political power now. And destroying it would cut off life support for all kinds of, for much of the world's population. It's like saying, it's like saying, if you could live forever, what would you do? Maybe someday people will find out how to be immortal. But once it's a real possibility, how can anyone imagine what they would do with that possibility? To say, if we were in an, if we were in an anarchist world, what would happen? It's certainly worth thinking about, and the problems that people suggest, like a resurgence of political power, are certainly worth thinking about. And I'm all for people imagining what kinds of ways of life might flourish in an anarchist world. But then that can lead to the debates: should it be anarcho-capitalism? Should it be anarcho-communism? Should it be, of all things, anarcho-fascism? There is actually such a doctrine. Uh, these just divert us from the real problem, which is to try to halt the worst parts of the human emergency and throttle back the worst abuses of political power for the sake of human well-being, for the sake of avoiding the incredible mass human suffering that it causes and will continue to cause. We're morally obliged to do that. Then, depending on what kind of success that has, we can think about what to do next. Otherwise, it's maybe sometimes very useful speculation, sometimes just a waste of time or misleading speculation.
Right, and I think you made a good quote in the video that is a good point to make here, which is you said that anarchism, that you can't tell people how anarchism would work, or you would be defying the premise of the anarchism. That I thought that was a really, really nice way of putting it, and I thought it was a really good point, because I think a lot of people don't think about the fact that that would be talking about a negative, and it's very difficult to talk about a negative.
Yeah, well, it's clear enough what we would mean by no rulers, anarchos, no rulers. That means the people take over, and the people are, if people are indeed ingenious and cooperative, then if we ever reach the stage where there are no rulers, people will do just fine. They'll do things that we couldn't imagine now, I think, that will make the anarcho-communist fantasy, anarcho-capitalist fantasy look absurd and primitive compared with the ways of living that people will create.
I think that's really good. I was going to ask you if you think that people thought that you stating that, you know, you can't tell people how anarchism would work because that would defy the premise of anarchism. If you think that some people saw that as a cop-out, and what you would say to that.
Well, a lot of people do think it's a cop-out because they believe in systems. They believe that we have this system now, whatever you call it, corporate tyranny, crony capitalism.
Right, they believe that's natural.
Well, they think we have one system and the only alternative is to replace it with another system. And if you don't have a better idea about how to do it, then shut up, kid. Or please save us. We don't know how to make a better system. Come on, Mr. Philosopher, you tell us your idea for a better system. All of you philosophers are supposed to have a better idea of how to live. I do have a better idea about how to live without domination. And that is because I believe in people and their ability to figure out how to live on their own. You've got to have faith in people, or there's no possibility for the future.
Now, you had stated previously that, and we've been talking about the fact that it is possible that people would end up reestablishing a government, which would be very unfortunate. But in the video, you talk of a general disarmament. What do you mean by this?
But I mean that if we can reach the point where military conflict is eliminated, or reduced to, if we can reach the point where military conflict is eliminated, where all the states in the world are purely defensive, where they have no aggressive military forces. Now think about that. Is a bomber a defensive military weapon? Of course not. Is an intercontinental ballistic missile a defensive weapon? Of course not. If we
can be in a state where the whole world is not anarchist, where it is simply one country that is anarchist.
Well, but
I don't believe that going to war should ever be on the top list of solutions. I think that war doesn't solve anything. It's the discussion after the violence that actually solves the problems. And why can't we just skip the childish war antics and have the discussion? But I mean, there is a argument to be made that having those defensive abilities prevents other countries from aggressing against a nomadic group of people if the United States were no longer the United States, but simply just a bunch of nomadic groups.
I'm saying if we could reach the point where all the states had only defensive militaries, meaning something that could shoot down a bomber if it came over your border, but not a bomber that could go over someone else's border.
And what would prevent them from using that military as non-defensive, but actually as offensive?
Well, by definition, if it's purely defensive, it can't be used offensively. Uh, Anti-aircraft guns that could shoot down incoming planes cannot be used to shoot a target in the other country. Let me continue. If we could reach the point where the world's militaries are reduced to a purely defensive basis, the next logical step would be disarmament, to remove all military weapons. We need to have nuclear disarmament as soon as possible, or there's not going to be a very good future. But general disarmament would mean basically abolishing the military.
See, the problem I have is with your premise. And that would state if everything were defensive, then that would be saying that there are no evil people in the world. And I don't in any utopian fantasy that's impossible. People need to be able to defend themselves against evil people.
There are certainly always evil people. There aren't necessarily going to be evil people in commands of military forces. If you remove the military forces, the threat of the evil people is negligible.
But you said that we should have defensive forces.
Look, the context that we're discussing is the end of the film where I'm talking about abolishing the institution of landholding by force of arms, by which I basically mean the state, where an armed faction people holds a certain region, and enforces its own ways in that region. To abolish that, you obviously have to abolish anything like a military state. The first step would be to eliminate conflict by developing diplomacy, by developing exchanges of cultures, all the kinds of things, and by removing the inequalities that are created, basically, to cause military conflict, and removing the corporate motives to engender conflict. So if you get these two guys hating each other enough, then you can sell your government jillions of dollars worth of weapons to fund the wars that conflict generates. If you can get past that, then the obvious thing is to demilitarize the states, get rid of their militaries entirely. That's what I mean by general disarmament. If, this is a stack of huge ifs about a future that I cannot foresee, but that may theoretically be possible, then you would no longer have the capability of having anything like a military state. Because the weapons systems, by weapons I don't mean something like a handgun, I mean stuff like the arsenal of the National Guard. I mean what's necessary to arm an effective military force.
But that sounds a lot like what the government's pushing right now. Like, citizens don't need assault weapons, so why don't we take them away from them?
No, and many people have mistaken me as saying that. I know people are very sensitive about guns.
Which is why I'm asking you about it.
Yeah. First of all, your assault rifle is no defense against the United States government.
Well, nobody's arguing that.
The idea that we need guns to protect ourselves from the government is absurd now. It carried much greater force even 50 or 100 years ago. But the way the police has been militarized around the United States, you're basically up against tanks. You're up against assault helicopters. You're up against, tanks have cannons. You can sit in your house with your assault rifle when one cannon shot can take out half of your block. This is absurd. If the United States really cracked down on its population, as has been done many places in the world, and not long ago, all the personal weapons you can have, and all of them in a community are not going to defend you. They're only going to lead to a greater slaughter.
So
Uh,
you're basically pointing out the vast odds between us being able to defend ourselves against the United States government. However, the American Revolution was at great odds to be able to separate themselves from Great Britain. So how do you rectify that situation?
the balance of arms uh, much less unequal. Furthermore, the settlers were on their home territory. It was a lot like Vietnam. The invaders didn't know the land. They were supplied from overseas. They had to get or steal or confiscate their life support from the people they were the people here. Completely different situation. Completely different situation. It was not the kind of imbalance between assault helicopters and assault vehicles and uh, gas weapons, being able to turn the electricity off, being able to turn the water off. Come on, it's a fantasy. And I'm afraid it's a fantasy that plays very strongly into the profits of the armaments and the gun lobbies. The more people believe that they need to be arming themselves against the coming crackdown by the government, the more guns you sell, the more ammo they're going to sell, the more profits they make. I'm not opposed to people owning personal weapons, although they make me squeamish. I do not like them, the weapons, not the people. But it's no defense against a real crackdown by the government, and it affords no real possibility of a revolution against the government. There's the balance of force is overwhelming. In the American Revolution, it didn't take much. It was musket versus musket, and it was numbers versus numbers. Large numbers of colonial forces could outsmart, outnumber, outlast because of their better provisions the invading British forces. Very different situation.
So in asking you where you are on the debate between violent and nonviolent revolution, I'm going to probably assume that you're probably on the nonviolent revolution side of the
Oh,
debate.
100%. 100%.
So am I, but I think maybe for different reasons. I think it's a cost-benefit analysis, and I think the costs far outweigh the benefits in a violent revolution.
I think the prospects of success in a violent revolution, at least in the United States, are zero. And any yes, military assault.
For a peaceful revolution, you mean?
No, no, violent.
Oh, a violent. The
We,
benefits are zero?
the chances of success are zero.
Oh, okay, okay.
And any serious violent assault against the government would result in greatly increased oppression. And maybe today we got the means of oppression like never existed before. Electronic surveillance, everything. A crackdown of a kind that has never taken place anywhere in the world is possible here if the state is provoked hard enough. And they're prepared to do it. They're preparing to do it. It's not for nothing that the police are becoming militarized. It's not for nothing that surveillance cameras and drones are everywhere. And it's not for nothing that they aren't banning guns. They don't care. If the gun really a threat to the government, they would be banned. So I'm entirely in favor of nonviolent opposition. Violent opposition is going to happen though because people are furious. And that really saddens me. In some local cases, it may have some good effects, but I'm opposed to it, and I would never count on those good effects. Other countries I can't speak for. I don't know what may happen in the case of violent insurrections against other centers of power. I just don't know enough about the conditions there, the militaries, the numbers, and so forth. But nonviolent doesn't have to mean friendly or pleasant. There are plenty of quite obstructive, destructive things that people can do nonviolently. I don't mean just going out and waving flowers and placards necessarily, but I'm entirely on the side of trying to bring this thing down nonviolently.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. I think that again, I just think that the costs greatly outweigh the benefits in the nonviolent case. There's really only one benefit in that it would potentially, if it were successful, it would happen faster than a peaceful revolution. And I don't think that that's a justification for a violent revolution. I think that the costs are way too high for that to even be, for time to be a major consideration. So hopefully people won't be foolish enough to think that we can effectively go up against the government. Where are you on the topic of secession? Because here in New Hampshire, we do, my friend Rob Mathias, who's host of the Rebel Love Show, and I do a lot of work on New Hampshire secession. We're hoping that we can inspire people to secede from the United States. What do you think of that?
I've never thought about it. It would be very interesting to see what comes of it. Off the top of my head, I can't imagine the federal government ever allowing a state to secede, but I really don't know. Basically, no comment.
Funny little point to that effect is that 14 states actually effectively seceded from Soviet Russia. And so we have reason to believe that the United States government, because I don't think that the United States government is nearly as bad as Soviet Russia was. So I mean, I think it's bad, but it's not that bad. And I mean, they were already a violent group of people and were recognized for their violence. The United States government has to at least maintain a facade of being nonviolent. So I think that there's reason to believe that it could potentially be successful. What do you think of
As I
that?
said, off the top of my head, my intuition says not a chance, but I haven't thought it through. And secessions have typically led to really oppressive. All I need to do is say Ukraine.
Yes, the Ukraine is a very unfortunate situation, which I actually want to do a whole episode on the Ukraine. I have not done enough research to properly be able to discuss it right now, but I do think that from my current research, you are making a good point. Now, I wanted to ask you a few philosophical points. So you state that it's wrong to domesticate human beings. I'm with you. I'm on board with that. But why is it also wrong, or why is it not also wrong to domesticate animals in that case?
I've wondered about that since I wrote my book.
Okay.
It's certainly not wrong in the same way, because an animal can't say no. An animal, is not the same kind of creature as you. I'm not saying it's not wrong. It's also not as destructive. You can cause. You can. It's certainly destructive to the animals in many cases, not in all. I certainly don't believe it's destructive to have domesticated cats, for instance. The uses of domestication, food production, animal testing, things like that, are horrid now. If I ever write a new edition of the book or another book, I'll have to really give that serious thought. I have bad misgivings about it that I didn't have when I first put my theory, because I was focusing on human events. I was focusing on the human community. And I don't see how the domestication of animals could possibly lead to anything like what happens when you harness human energy to destructive purposes, in terms of, say, damaging the habitat. But I think it's a very important point that I hope to think about more someday, and I really can't say anything succinct about it now.
I would be very interested in having you on my show again if you do explore that idea. I am a hunter. I do believe that animals can be hunted. I am never cruel about it. I hunt birds, and I try to hit them with a kill shot every time. If I don't, I try and end their lives as quickly as possible. I think animal cruelty is just, there's no reason for it, and it's needless violence. But, it's an idea that I haven't explored thoroughly either, and I'd be interested in exploring it with you.
You see, my whole argument against political power isn't primarily moral. Did I just lose you, Lauren? Did I lose
I'm
you there
sorry.
for a minute?
Yes, you did. Your whole argument against it
Is not primarily a moral argument, like the the anarcho-capitalists who base their argument on the non-aggression principle and so forth. I agree with the non-aggression principle, but my argument is against political power is about sustainability, basically. That apart from all the mass human suffering it causes, once this thing is created, if it keeps following its own internal logic, it will lead to something like the human emergency. It's intolerable for that reason. Um, I believe it seems like you'd have to argue that it's bad to make a person into a tool, to make them a means to your end, to rob them of their autonomy. Certainly no one would approve of that being done to them, maybe apart from masochists or something. It seems to me the morality of it's pretty clear, that just on basis of common decency and live and let live and treat others as you choose to be treated, that one small group of people getting together and treating the other as their domestic animals is horrible. So the morality is clear to me, but I don't base my theory on a moral argument. I assume certain common sense morality for it, but the argument follows a real different kind of logic about the destructiveness, the inevitable destructiveness of the thing once it's created and set in motion.
Interesting. So one more philosophical question that I have for you. You talk a lot about the tools of a tool's operating principle. This is very similar to Ayn Rand's theory on essence, if I take it correctly. Are you a fan of hers?
No. I was. In my youth, I discovered her work when I was 16 in the total intellectual vacuum of the McCarthy years. I had never read a word of philosophy, and I fell madly in love and became a total Randian ideologue, or Rand, for about 2 or 3 years. I could almost recite Galt's speech. I was brilliant. I was a master of objectivism. I mean, I knew that philosophy totally, and I was totally committed to it. It was my first experience of thinking in principles, of reasoning through to conclusions from assumptions, of building structures of ideas and seeing the world through these ideas, and my first experience of how different the world looked when you had a clear philosophical lens to view it through. It was wonderful. And it also led me to my lifelong hatred of intense political power, But some older friends kind of shook me out of that self-indoctrination, and from there I went my own way and thought up my own philosophy for the rest of my life. And now I think very differently about many things. The operating principle is a whole lot different from Rand's essence, I think, because for her the essence is the particular, like Aristotle's distinguishing characteristics. It's the properties of an object that uniquely distinguish it from other similar objects, and that are therefore involved in defining it, right? To define something is to state its essence, its distinguishing characteristic. The operating principle of a tool is much simpler. A tool is a device that serves a purpose, or it wouldn't be a tool. And the operating principle is kind of like a patent. It's a statement of how it serves that purpose. The operating principle of an axe is to chop wood by a wedge on a lever, whack, like that. And that defines the axe given its purpose, not its essence. I think an essence is likely something deeper and subtler than the purpose. And the operating principle can distinguish how different tools do a certain job. Do a similar job, for example. You can use an axe or a chainsaw to cut wood, but a chainsaw uses a completely different operating principle. They're both wood cutting tools. Does that make any sense?
A little bit, yeah. I would definitely like to have you on sometime to talk to you about why it was that I don't want to focus on it today too much, because it pulls away from your incredible work. Even with the disagreements that we have on it, I still think that it's a very worthwhile video. But I'd love to talk to you sometime about why it is that you ended up leaving, not leaving, because that's almost too culty, but I guess there is a separate cult surrounding it that I'm not allowed to be a part of. Um, but why you kind of left Ayn Rand's philosophy. Um, because I've had dealings with her orthodoxy objectivists that has made it so that I want to create my own philosophy and I want to work towards writing my own philosophy because I don't want to deal with there's so much more out there to explore, which is why I created the new channel. And also, I just felt that I didn't want to keep having to explain that I was an anarcho-objectivist when I could just write my own philosophy instead of leaning on hers. So, but anyway, you may have had a similar situation. So, I'm sorry, what did
I'd love to come back and talk about it at length. In fact, last night I was sitting by my wood stove and thinking, my goodness, I haven't spoken to an objectivist for 40 years. This is going to be an interesting conversation. It was really kind of a time trip. I think you might be very interested in some of the stages in the path. It was a fairly sudden break because I was indoctrinated. I thought I was an independent thinker, but what that meant was that I had memorized and was completely adept at reciting Rand's philosophy. Of course, it made sense to me, and I thought I'd convince myself of it. But basically, I'd been indoctrinated in the schools and media and through my right-wing Republican father in a certain kind of American ideology. And when I found Rand, I snapped into another ideology. It's very easy to do. It's like when you've been in an abusive situation. It's very easy to move into another almost identical abusive situation when you think you're escaping the abuse. But indoctrination mind abuse. And
yeah, I actually warn my audience from doing exactly that. I don't subscribe to her philosophy in a way that most objectivists subscribe to her philosophy. In fact, I don't really consider myself to be an objectivist. Objectivist girl is an objectivist. She teaches objectivism exclusively. But I created that persona because Lauren Rumpler is an independent thinker, and she uses Ayn Rand's philosophy as a basis to be able to look at different philosophies, and really her view on nature and metaphysics and epistemology is the reason that I'm able to correctly identify reality from emotion. And so I use objectivism as a tool to be able to examine reality and examine other philosophies. So I wouldn't consider myself to be an objectivist because that word carries far too many connotations for me to be comfortable with it.
I see that now that we've had this conversation. Last night I wasn't sure because I just knew the objectivist girl epithet.
Yeah, you're not talking to objectivist girl today. You're talking to Lauren Rumpler. This is part of the new channel.
Good. Well, I give you every encouragement in thinking for yourself. It's an unbelievable adventure, and it will lead you to places you can imagine now.
I'm super excited about it, that's for sure. I wanted to get into a few more things. Oh, yes, I thought this was interesting. So you seem to indicate that classes are kept divided intentionally by government for control. Do you believe this? Is this something I should have gotten out of the video? I think it's worth examining.
Yes, I do, essentially. Many people, especially Marxists, believe that what I call domination arises because of class structures, that you have a ruling class at the top of a hierarchy of increasing privilege and a subordinated working class at the bottom of the structure. And that basically is what political power is the institutionalization of hierarchy. I think that even if no such thing existed, if there were only rulers and a gap and human cattle at the bottom, the rulers would benefit by creating a class structure of relative degrees of privilege, first to win people's loyalty at the higher levels of the structure, and then to divide the community within the classes between the more and less privileged, so they can fight each other and take the heat off the rulers. If the entire community unites against the rulers, the odds are pretty bad. But if you have factions in the community fighting each other, then you're relatively secure. So it's a means of control. First, to win loyalty, and second, to cause internal divisions that deflect the hostility of the people who suffer the most, to deflect their hostility away from you.
Right. I actually think that that's a really good point. So when I heard that, I actually paused the video and I started thinking about it. And I thought to myself, it's interesting because it's a good means of control when you put different people at a different, because I'm sure you've seen Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I totally agree with his hierarchy of needs. It's a wonderful table. And so when you put people on different spots in the hierarchy of needs, it's very difficult for them to be able to relate and therefore come together to achieve one goal. Now, if you put everybody on the bottom rung, they'll come together and try and satisfy the next level of needs, and you'll see a resistance against government in a collective action together. However, if you put people at different spots, they can't relate to one another, and therefore they see each other as competing for those spots on the hierarchy, instead of the government being the preventative measure to moving to the next step together.
Mm-hmm.
So.
And further divisions can enhance that. As I said in the video, one of the most important divisions is between men and women. You find that the prehistoric societies, and even some very late ones early in the Bronze Age, were not patriarchic. The Minoan civilization on Crete, I believe, was matriarchal in its early stages. Then you get patriarchy uniformly, because by dividing the community between men and women, and regarding women as an inferior kind of being, who are basically the property of the men, you've also internally divided the community. Through the classes.
Yeah.
Right through the classes. Racial divisions, religious divisions, and so forth can further that effect. The more different ways you chop the community up into differently privileged sectors in conflict with each other, the more it diffuses the resistance that could be put against the actual rulers.
Very, very interesting. Now, the last topic that I had is potentially very controversial, and the reason that I wanted, the biggest reason I wanted to have this interview with you. You talk about land held in common for the common good. Now, I'm not certain, but it almost seems as if you are against land holding by force.
I certainly am.
Okay, and do you believe that just on the governmental level or on the individual level as well?
Let me first explain what I mean.
Okay.
Landholding by force of arms I define as the fundamental component of this engine, because to have a community to domesticate, you have to occupy their lands. They can't just all say, oh, well, this is not a good place to sit. We'll move to another side of the theater. People have lived where they've lived for generations. Their life support comes from the land. You have to occupy the land by force. Now, when I say the land can only be held in common for the common good or seized by force, I'm really cutting to the bone there. The land is not a thing that I believe can be owned. You can own things that are produced from the land, but not the land. Much the same as I believe an employer can own the employee's labor, but not the employee. Everything comes from the land. It is not one thing among others. I believe that any sustainable, really anarchist society has to be based on a universal landholding, where not just the person here or the person next door, but the entire community and the entire human community is responsible in making decisions about land use. That doesn't mean people would not have private land use. In fact, now, I own about an acre of land here in Taos, but I don't own it. The government holds it. I pay a property tax fee for occupying, putting it to certain uses. I don't have mineral rights. There are certain things I can't do here. The government is the landholder. Although I say I own it, I do not hold it by force. I mean, maybe I can shoot a guy who comes over the fence without getting put in jail, but that's not what we're talking about here. I believe that the only way to really keep the lands safe and sanctity, it's everything, Lauren. It's where the oxygen comes from. It's the source of life and of all goods on earth. That has to be a human responsibility, not the responsibility of any one institution, and certainly not something that can be seized by force. I mean, people are always making far-fetched examples about, what if a company did this or something? But it just popped in my mind this morning. The distinctive feature in the Taos landscape is this beautiful Taos mountain. The Taos Pueblo is under it. It's the longest continually occupied pueblo in the United States. What if someone bought Taos Mountain and decided to level its top? This would be horrible. Maybe by some capitalist standards it would be moral, but it would destroy the landscape. The land is the closest thing. Private property is the sacrament of capitalism. To me, the sacrament of the free world is the world itself, the land. And that has to be held in reverence and be the common responsibility of everybody. I just don't see any alternative. I don't see how to start parceling out absolute control of land in the sense of forcible ownership and rights to do anything you want to it without opening the door to all of the horrible things that have happened since domination began.
So, if I get this correctly, you are, I wouldn't say against, because that's too forceful, but it seems that you have issues with individuals owning property as well. Am I correct?
I have issues with individuals having absolute control over land use. People must have private land use, even in communities like the Native Americans. On the Pueblo is owned by the people. The land is not the tribal leaders or the elders, it's everybody's. Given parts of the land to use, they live there. This is where the so-and-so family or clan lives. Private land use is necessary for human communities, but absolute, unconditional control over what's done with the land, I don't think should be granted to any particular individual or agency. Yes.
Okay, so you think that it would be best to have communities own land, but not individuals?
Well, let me put it this way. I think no one should own it in the same way that I own my toothbrush. The control of land should probably be concentrated in the community that occupies it, but not be restricted to that exclusively. Because what community A right here does may have big effects on what community B adjacent to it experiences. So I believe the concentration should be greatest in the people who occupy and use the land life support, but that everyone should have some say over what is done to any land. That's the only way I can see to keep it safe for the whole future.
Okay.
Maybe I'm not doing something. As I said earlier, I can't foresee how an anarchist world would work.
I understand that. Now, I obviously disagree with this. So let's go about it this way. If I am John Galt and I built an engine, should I be able to own that engine and do with it as I please? And defend it from any aggression, with force if necessary?
Do with it as you please. What if as you please involves harming someone?
No, you can't violate anyone else's rights. I should put that as a premise for this argument. Nothing I'm indicating will ever harm anyone else's individual rights or their property. So you can't violate their property rights, and you can't violate their life with it, because you have a right to your own life by nature, because you are endowed by nature with your own life and therefore have a right to defend it. And so you own it, and you should be able to defend that, much like you can defend, well, I believe that you can defend anything you create with that life, because that is a product of your time and your energy, which is a part of your life. And so therefore that engine is an extension of your life. So should you be able to defend your right to use this engine and to own this engine, let's just go with to completely own this engine and not have it taken from you and be able to defend it by force if necessary. Not even to use it, just to own it. We'll start there.
With the emphasis on if necessary, sure.
Okay. Yeah, and I mean, that's the issue I take with the non-aggression principle, is that the lines of if necessary are too blurred in my opinion, on the non-aggression principle, but I'm doing an extensive study to do a talk about it at Liberty Forum, the issues with the non-aggression principle. I advocate for man as an ends in and of himself as a better principle than the non-aggression principle. However, so if I only use necessary force, and I have a good grasp on what is necessary, I don't violate anyone else's rights to their life because I respect their time and their energy and their life, because those things are an extension of it, and I respect everyone else's rights to their property, then can I use the engine in any way I please?
Sounds good.
Okay, cool. So let's move this engine to be my home. Okay, so we're going to move from engine to home. So I have a home, and I'm not violating anyone's rights. I'm not going to pick it up and drop it on somebody, which is ridiculous. But I respect everyone's rights. Should I be able to defend my home, which I paid for or built myself with my time and energy, much like I built that engine, by force if necessary?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Now, let's move it to a larger space. So I've decided to plant a garden. I've planted food for myself. I'm taking care of myself through my land. And this is my sustenance, and I put energy into it. It supports my life and supports all my needs. Should I have a right to defend all of that land if by force if necessary?
The garden.
The garden.
Yeah, and we're assuming that you're on a piece of property, right?
Okay. So you believe that people should be able to defend what they're using?
What they produce, what they use, objects, and the conditions for the use within, reasonable limits. Sure, land is something different. The land is where it's from.
Now, do you believe that there's a certain period of time at which if you're not using it, that it can be taken by somebody else?
That would be for the communities involved to decide their customs and conventions and practices about.
Okay, so that's where we separate. All right, so we've agreed on everything up until this point. Now, the issue with that is that we've just gone from the individual having rights to the community having rights. And so it seems like there is a period of time at which, if not being used, it should be up to the discretion of the community. Now, I disagree with that. I
said it might be the case or it might not be, depending.
Oh, it might. Okay, it might be the
case. Wherever you happen to be living in this hypothetical example.
Now, if the community decides that they want my engine at any point, should the community be able to take my engine away from me?
Well, I think that would be a very nasty and unlikely thing to do, and in terms of what we've agreed to so far, no.
But what if I won't sell it to them and they need it to advance their technology and build a better life for the community.
Then you have a conflict to resolve, and if they come after it with force, you may have to defend it.
Okay, so you don't. That's the thing, is that you're stating that land must be held in common for the common good. But if I am allowed to own that engine, then it is not being held for the common good. It's being held for my good because I built it and it's mine.
I believe personal belonging are a different category of thing than the land. Basically, it just occurred to me, maybe I'd argue that the land has rights.
The
The
land.
land, yes. Well, it's a living thing, or it's the source of all life, certainly. It's a being, I believe, the planet being. It's not an organism, it's not a creature, like dogs or cats or bacteria, but if anything is alive, it's the planet we're living on. And we've seen what can be done to the planet destructively when controls on protecting it don't exist. If we're going to have a future, we need to think in a completely different way about the land than about anything else. The idea that the land is a commodity that can be bought, sold, owned, destroyed, exploited. We need a better idea than that. We need to create a new category for the source of all things than the categories that we've used to describe the things that have come from that source. And we need to find a way to have some reverence and great fear about destroying this source if we're going to be here for more than a few more decades.
And I'm on board with respecting the environment, especially now that I watched your video. It was a big turning point for me. I'd always stated that, it's great that there are people out there cleaning up the environment, but I don't care. But, thinking about if there were a situation where I could potentially be free, I would need that land. And I think that land doesn't need its own rights, mainly because man will respect it if it is necessary. So men respect what is necessary, like food. So men respect their food. They respect the things that they need in order to sustain their life because it's innately incentivized. So I think that people will have a greater respect for land on an individual level just because it is the provider of all the things that they need, much like the Indians respected the land and understood they had gods for the land and worshipped them. It was a little odd, but from what they knew at the time, it probably made perfect sense. But they respected the land because they knew that from the land, from the sun, from the environment, came everything that they ever needed. So I think that is innately built in us. But the problem is that government has made us so infantilized and has hidden us from real need and real want that we have no concept or grasp of what the land is really doing for us because we're so far removed from it. What do you think of that?
I think that's all true. I think that in this imaginary situation where we've rid the world of domination, the natural respect and reverence for the land would blossom for it. But to allow it to blossom, I think we have to approach it, and we have to return to the way it was treated before civilization and states and borders, where you had exclusive agency of power with jurisdiction over the region that could do anything to it they wanted. If they wanted those trees for their ships and their palaces, they could drive the people who lived there out and whack the trees down. That's what I'm saying we need to do away with. That the destructive use of land, and the only way I can foresee to do that is to keep a general kind of counter control over what any individual, institution, or agency does to the land. Maybe that makes me an anarcho-communist, but I'm not talking about collective ownership. I'm talking about universal control over something, how the land is used, and admitting that the land is a different order of things than the things that are made from it. I'd recommend that you think about my analogy before we talk again, between owning a person and the products of their labor, and owning the land and things that are produced from the land. I think it's a very deep idea. And I think
Yeah, and these are the kinds of ideas that I want to start exploring with my channel is reaching out because this is far beyond objectivism. I mean, objectivism is always involved because we need to look at objective reality instead of our feelings, emotions, whims. So objectivism is a good core to have, but these things are so far beyond objectivism. But I think that we might be able to agree on this. Because I think what you would be interested in would be a gradual rollback. And I'm on board with the gradual rollback. I think that people have been infantilized for so long that they don't know how to take care of themselves. So the best way to handle it is a peaceful separation from the United States, then from the United States federal government, then a peaceful separation from our state governments, and then potentially what I would say is eventually a peaceful separation if desired by each individual community, a peaceful separation from local governments, if that's what they would like. And so do you think that that might be something you could get on board with?
if it were possible.
Well, yes, we're all,
Lovely.
operating on whether this is possible or not.
I don't foresee political power letting go without a tremendous struggle because there's too much at stake for the people who benefit from it.
No kidding.
Relinquish a good deal. The whole world, in fact. These people own the world, Lauren. They basically own the world.
Isn't it terrifying?
Yes. Yes, it is. And the institutions that select for such psychopathic mentalities that are willing to be in such a position, with no remorse. It's terrifying. I don't think it's possible to get rid of it without struggle, but I don't know. As I said, I don't know what could happen. If the kind of scenario you described would be lovely, and if it could happen, I would be all for it. But I don't see it happening.
Well, I think that's all the questions I had, and I think we came to some really good understandings and conclusions, and I think that, if it is possible, I think we've started to kind of describe a world that we would like to see in this event, and I think it's all up to the individual what we end up seeing. And I want to thank you, Mark, for being a part of this. We've been going on for 2 hours, and you've been great to have on. I've learned a lot, and I hope my audience will too.
I hope so too. It's really been fun, Lauren. I've really enjoyed it.
Good, good. Well,
I watch the video.
I'm sorry?
I hope everyone will watch the video. I don't want to convince anyone that I'm right. I wasn't disappointed in your questions. I wanted to make people think, and I'm delighted that it did make you think.
It did.
The video is meant to be thought-provoking. My ideas are food for thought, and I hope to raise issues for people to think about. That's all. If anyone agrees with me, I'm almost a little nervous. Like, did they overlook something that I overlooked too? What flaws am I going to find in this? I keep thinking about it over the next years. But Mark Korsky's Engines of Domination. It's on YouTube. Just Google it. It comes up instantly.
It'll be on a link to this video. It'll be linked.
There's also an Engines of Domination channel at YouTube that has a whole lot of other interviews, including this one soon, and other short videos that are related. And I didn't think about it, and I hope it does. It's certainly entertaining. It will certainly reward your hour to watch the thing. It's only 1 hour long.
Yes, it's shorter than this interview. But I had a great time, and I know my audience will really love this, and you guys should definitely go check out the video. And, as I always say, guys, knowledge is not for all men, but for those who seek it, so keep seeking. Make sure you check me out at laurenrumpler.com or facebook.com/laurenrumplerproductions, and I hope you all have a beautiful, wonderful day. Peace, love, and liberty.